Real quick, you can lead your own head-to-head battles on the go with today's sponsor, Warhammer 40,000 Tacticus, the tactical mobile game exploding in popularity right now. Please stick around toward the end of the video for more on how you can conquer the battlefields of the far future. The records of those days begin to repeat themselves. Plundered were the old shrines, ravaged were the lands. And when so many churchyards sat damp with the blood of holy men, when champions fell, when wives and children were taken into slavery, that was when Ireland knew what had washed onto her shores, when she understood the wrath of the Vikings. They arrived in 795, 2 years after they first struck England. Their fleets harried Ireland year after year, and these Norsemen grew more audacious. In time, they would establish permanent settlements along the coasts and waterways. Once sparsely populated, Dublin became a fortified and populous center of Viking power in Ireland, connecting Irish shores with the outer world through a rich trade in goods, treasures, and slaves. These colonies were also bolstered by the arrival of Scandinavian royals, likely including Ivar the Boneless, who established their own ruling dynasties. But lasting Viking conquest beyond the coast would be difficult. Any who ventured farther inland trespassed onto the lands of over 100 petty kings and their clans. The Irish lived in so-called ring forts, usually stone or earthen enclosures overlooking farmland and pastures dotted with livestock. The people dressed in linens, belts, and woolen cloaks, and displayed status by the quality of their brooches. Although this island had come to embrace Christianity since the 5th century efforts of St. Patrick, the Vikings had not brought war to a saintly or tranquil country. The clans of Ireland plundered, raided, and fought incessantly for power. Here, a Viking warrior society found itself surrounded by an Irish warrior society. Vikings fought clad in helmets and various forms of armor, with spears, swords, and great axes, while Irishmen rarely fought with armor, relying on the agile use of small shields, spears, swords, and darts. While the Vikings slew their kings, raided, and exacted tribute, the embattled Irish struck back with such force that the Vikings were forced to forge alliances and play politics. To this end, Viking leaders sometimes married into the lines of Irish nobility, and some became Christian. But favor with one clan meant enmity with another, and coalitions rose against the Norsemen. Ousted from Dublin in 902, the Vikings then resumed raids with unparalleled aggression, recaptured Dublin, and made war on the neighboring kingdoms. It was told that neither veneration nor honor nor protection for God or for man was felt by this ferocious pagan people. They reduced the Irish to bondage and slavery. Many were the blooming, lively women and the gentle youths, whom they carried off into oppression and bondage over the broad green sea. Alas, many and frequent were the bright and brilliant eyes that were suffused with tears and dimmed with grief and despair, at the separation of son from father and daughter from mother and brother from brother and relatives from their race and from their tribe. The region of Munster bore much of this bloodshed, and from there rose the man called Brian Boru. The effusive histories of him would say, "Bad was the luck of the foreigners on the day when that youth was born." In truth, Brian's father was the chief of the Delcas clan, and as Brian may have been the youngest of 12 sons, their regional throne was not destined to pass to him. But these were dark times, wars against rivals, and the Vikings claimed the lives of his father and many of his siblings. It came to pass that his brother Mathgavin assumed the throne and struck a truce with the Vikings. Brian, the later accounts told, would not have it. By day and night he hunted the Vikings, sleeping on damp ground, embracing the wild, exchanging kill for kill, until the number of his followers had fallen to 15 warriors. The weary Brian then reproached his brother for making peace when their forebears would have made war. Mathgavin in the Council of Chiefs heeded his words. In 967, they met their enemies in great battle, breaking and beheading the fleeing Vikings until they came to the Viking town of Limerick. If Brian was brave and wise, he was not merciful. The fort and the good town they reduced to a cloud of smoke and to red fire afterwards. The whole of the captives were collected on the hills. Every one of them that was fit for war was killed, and everyone that was fit for a slave was enslaved. Victory had proven their strength. Brian's brother reigned as king over all of Munster, but in 976 old rivals captured and executed Mathgavin. Whispers of the ancient world survived in Ireland. Although the pagan kings of yore were buried deep in earth and legend, their hallowed bloodlines were claimed by countless would-be kings, and old mounds, woods, and stones remained the objects of veneration. So it was that Brian ascended to the kingship of his clan under the shade of their sacred tree, and with little delay he gathered his forces. He raided a monastic island, slaughtering there the Viking ruler of Limerick and his sons. He brought ruin to his brother's killers and reclaimed authority over Munster. But the rise of Brian Boru had drawn the eye of the powerful ruler of the southern Ineal. In name the High King of Ireland, Mael Shecnel II had valiantly forced the Vikings of Dublin to submit to him in 980. Now he raided Brian's lands and uprooted the sacred Dalcassian tree. No doubt furious, Brian sustained war with this new nemesis for years, all while continuing to subdue surrounding lands. He would harness the fleets of subject Vikings to carry his marauding armies into Mael Shecnel's territory. And in 997, after over a decade of animosity, the two kings made peace. It was agreed that Mael Shecnel would retain rule of the north, and Brian Boru would be king over the south. It was perhaps this shift in overlordship that stirred Sitric Silkbeard, the Viking king of Dublin, into rebellion along with the province of Leinster. The might of Dublin had long laid dormant under Mael Shecnel. Now was a chance to test this Brian Boru of Munster. The king answered. In the closing days of 999, Brian Boru and his new ally, Mael Shecnel, marched toward Dublin. The Dublin Norse and the men of Leinster sallied out to confront them at the great pitched battle of Glenmama. The armies fought with dauntless courage, and the hills were painted with carnage. Hundreds fell to the victorious spears and swords of Brian's men. Brian then did to the Vikings as they had done to his people. His army spent the first days of the year 1000 burning and plundering Dublin, its rich markets and stolen treasures. The army captured so many of the Vikings' women and children that a later record exaggerated that the Irish no longer labored at all, for all their farms were worked and meals prepared by these foreign slaves. In reality, Brian dealt pragmatically with these Vikings. When Sitric submitted to him, Brian allowed him to return to the throne of Dublin. Many of these so-called foreigners were gradually assimilating into a Norse-Irish people. Sitric was in fact the son of Brian's wife, or former wife, from her previous marriage with the late Viking king of Dublin. Brian now secured the loyalty of his new subject by marrying off one of his daughters from another marriage to Sitric, making the rebellious Viking his son-in-law. All the great Viking ports of Ireland now answered to Brian, hubs of commerce that provided him with wealth, fine ships, and warriors. Certain of his own strength, Brian contested the rule of Mael Shecnel in the north. The latter attempted to mount resistance, but ultimately conceded. So it was that Brian Boru became the High King of Ireland. The aging king made great journeys across his realm, securing the formal submission of recalcitrant kings and courting the favor of Armagh, the influential church said to have been founded by St. Patrick. There a cleric bestowed on Brian the title Imperator Scotorum, Emperor of the Gaels. His high kingship begat relative peace. He busied himself building great forts and round towers and patronizing churches. But the ambitions of subject dynasties meant that there was nearly always a defiant lord in revolt. Catastrophe struck in 1013 when Dublin and Leinster again rebelled. Mael Shecnel aided Brian and marched to pacify Dublin, but some of his forces, including his son, were slaughtered by Sitric. Sitric then recruited Vikings from overseas to challenge Brian. Earls and warriors from the Orkneys and Isle of Man sailed into Dublin Bay. Some of these men had likely aided in the Danish conquest and brief rule of England months earlier. And in 1014, the graying King Brian, variously recorded between the ages of 73 and 88, mustered an army several thousand strong, with aid from a distant edge of the Gaelic world, an Earl of Northeast Scotland. Over the spring, they ravaged rebellious lands on the path to Dublin. Later histories frame the coming battle as a last stand for the fate of Ireland. Such overstatement notwithstanding, the threat of a revived autonomous Viking Dublin with foreign backing was indeed grave. The morning of Good Friday, Brian beheld this enemy across a plain. They spread far, their Norse shields, mail, and helmets shining in the rising sun. Later accounts of the battle have it that the army of Brian, led by his son Murchad, met the charge of the Leinster forces, and the Viking flanks closed in. It was poetically told that in these roaring hours spent hacking and stabbing, men were so doused in blood as to be unrecognizable to their kin, and their spears became heavy with the hair of butchered enemies. Brian's son Murchad perished, but as the day darkened and the fallen lay in the thousands, the enemy fell back, some wading to their Viking ships, drifting away in the tide, only to drown. When victory was near, a band of Vikings made an assault on the king's position. An Icelandic saga tells an elaborate tale that it was the Viking Brodir who beheaded Brian, that the king's guard quickly avenged their leader. Wolf the Quarrelsome cut open Brodir's belly and led him round and round the trunk of a tree, and so wound all his entrails out of him. Whatever the truth of that day, it was clear that Leinster and the Vikings were beaten, and the High King of Ireland, Brian Boru, was no more. So ended the Battle of Clontarf, widely hailed as Brian's great victory and sacrifice. The death of the king's heir left the dynasty to his other sons. Some record that Mael Shechnel regained the title of High King, but his authority would never be so great as Brian's. Sitrick, meanwhile, continued to rule in Dublin. The Norse settlements of Ireland remained centers of trade for many years to come, but their power had been increasingly curtailed and harnessed by the Irish. For the subjugation of the Viking invaders and their descendants was not Brian's achievement alone, but that of many generations of Irish kings and warriors who refused to yield. Stories of rising conquerors are undeniably compelling, and I think that's why I find Warhammer 40,000 Tacticus so fun. You're thrown into the grim, dark future of the Warhammer 40,000 galaxy, and it's your task to conquer the battlefields using tactical, fast-paced gameplay in the palm of your hand. You build your army collecting and leading over 60 legendary Warhammer 40,000 champions from 15 playable factions. I also love how engaged and passionate the player base is. Over 3.5 million people have joined the Tacticus battles. And you can join that player base anytime from anywhere in fast-paced PvE campaigns, tightly competitive PvP battles, and collaborative boss fights under your guild banner. The game also features the super fun Adeptus Mechanicus faction, whose attacks combine arcane weaponry and mechanical cybernetic augmentations. With new modes and content frequently added, Tacticus is an ever-growing quality tactical challenge, and it's free to play. Please download from the link in the description and start conquering the battlefields of the far future.